I think this is an especially apt moment to be examining China's image in the world, and whether a country's policies and actions, both at home and abroad, are adding to the brand value, as we like to say in the corporate world, or taking away or subtracting from it. I think it's well accepted the first 20 to 25 years of reform were characterized by the Dengist restraint that as China had enough on its plate at home, it internationally would be a better idea, would be wise, therefore, to keep a relatively low profile. China's quote-unquote peaceful rise of the past decade has been very much predicated on this Dengist conceit, if you want to put it that way, on soft power and on being a responsible international actor. I think in many ways that policy has been quite successful in terms of building its image abroad, and I wonder now whether we are running into a few problems. I mentioned earlier at the beginning, we've arguably seen a bit of a drift from the peaceful rise with a slightly more aggressive stance towards territorial issues, for example. We're seeing in the corporate sector, we're seeing a move of foreign investors turning a little bit. GE's Jeff Immelt recently, as I'm sure you're all aware, accused China of hostility towards foreign investors and of being increasingly protectionist. So is China's image abroad changing? Is it shifting? What indeed is China's image abroad? These are questions which I'm going to put to my guest, who I'm absolutely delighted to say has joined us coming in from the State House Diamond, the CEO of Weber Shandling, global CEO of Weber Shandling, the PR agency, and of course Weber Shandling's business, which Harris is, by general consent, been very successful in growing over the last 10 years, is mainly, a large part of it is advising governments on their image, although, of course, Harris was very careful about telling us which governments he advises. Thank you very much for joining us today, Harris. And I wanted to just kick off in a very straightforward way, where we just talk a little bit about, if you could share some of your thoughts on what it is that makes a country's image, and how do countries generate an image, how do they change over time, and what is the relationship between an image and a brand, and what is the difference in a sense?
I guess I would start by saying that an image is basically, and a brand is in many cases, defined by everything we can see and we can touch about a country. It has everything to do with the people and how the people are represented, everything to do with the culture, everything to do with the companies and corporations that exist in the country. And when you put it all together, in China, what's fascinating to me is China's brand is being subsumed to a large extent, I would argue, by the very awesome nature of its economy, the second largest in the world, and by its power, or its perception of being a power, in Asia. I mean, the world has seemingly accepted that, but at the same time, what's happening is everything else about China is actually being lowered. We don't really get a sense any longer outside of China, when we talk about whether or not we should invest in China, about the people of China. To the extent that we do, we talk about some of the issues and some of the problems. We talk about the concerns about wages, and we can talk about the concerns about a free flow of information. But China's very strength right now, I would argue, is actually sort of hurting its brand around the world. Well, one could say that in the last, 5,000 years, there's always a threat to China with respect to a military threat. And I would say that today the threat to China has much more to do with its image, its brand, its reputation. I think the questions that people are asking are no longer questions about whether or not China will be a world power. I think everybody has accepted the fact that China is a world power. I think the question that people are asking now is how will it behave as a world power? And that question fundamentally is all in the eyes of the beholder. There are some who are concerned that it will not necessarily join the world community, but it will seek to advance its own national interests in a way that in today's world is actually being questioned by many, many nations as to what the appropriate role. So I think that issue out there, which is how will China behave, is really going to define how China's brand is is actually seen over the next 10 to 15 years?
The idea that China's brand, well, you mentioned actually in an early conversation that we had that in some ways China is on the cusp of having a brand. It doesn't yet have it, and I wanted to return to my first observational question really about the difference between an image and a brand. We've got a growing and changing image of China in the world. We talked about that just a little bit, but what doesn't have a brand yet?
To an extent, I think it has a brand. It has a brand of strength, it has a brand of growth, and it has a brand of question, which is what will the China of the future be? When we talked about Jeff Immelt and GE, forgetting whether or not he wanted to make that comment the way he made it and the way it was picked up, clearly many corporations around the world are questioning whether or not China is as open as they once imagined it to be. There are questions about inland investment being made in China right now, whether or not the return over the next few years will be quite what was once expected. Now, some will argue that China's brand overshadowed the rational discussion of that. After all, when we talk about a nation that has so quickly become the second strongest economic power, by definition, many corporations outside of China therefore assumed that growth would be as tremendous as the growth that they saw was taking place within China itself for the Chinese people. And I think that is basically, blinded us. So I would say that China's image right now is an image that is in a little bit of flux. It's an image that says if one were to come here, more likely than not, growth will be dramatic. But it's also an image that says if one comes here, it will not be as easy to necessarily build a business as one once thought it was going to be. And that question is obviously affecting China's brand. Because China would like to have a brand of innovation. China would like to have a brand of openness. China would like to have a brand of entrepreneurship. By the way, so will every other country in the world. China has gotten away to a certain extent with having a brand with some of those attributes for the last few years. Mostly because growth has been relatively easy for multinationals who come here. But I think as that gets more difficult, as Chinese privately owned enterprises get stronger and stronger, as the state-owned enterprises slowly but surely figure out ways of making their brands, actually brands that consumers are interested in buying products from, I think the multinationals continue to find difficulties. Or not find it as easy, let me say it that way. And therefore the brand is going to change, the image will change, and I think the image is going to be great country, great place to come, place that you have to tell your board you're going to be. But the image is also going to be difficult, not as easy as we once thought, going to take a lot more time than we originally believed to build the businesses we want to build.
Perhaps we can come back to the commercial image and the commercial brand that China is trying to project. But at the heart of a lot of this, of course, is a political issue, and you alluded to that. You alluded to political developments at some level. A brand, an image, has to have something tangible underneath it. It has to have a sense of truth underneath it. And one of the clear problems that China has is addressing this issue on the one hand of it being great power, emerging great power, and the other being somewhat restrained and even repressive at home. We've seen obviously issues like the democracy movement, the whole question of Shanghai, the Peace Prize. All of these issues rising again as the political temperature rises in China before the transition. What are the implications for China of these underlying political issues that it faces for its image and its brand?
Clearly in a world where everybody believes that they have the opportunity today to pass judgment on each other, which is really taking place right now, corporate social responsibility movements are much more interested in many cases in what's happening in other countries than necessarily what's happening in their own country. We're seeing this issue with respect to, in the United States, tremendous interest in the death penalty outside of the United States. In the United States, we have relatively, I would say, an argument about the issue, but nowhere near what you would see when you travel around the world and read the world's newspapers. So the focus on China right now is a real focus, and it's a focus by activists, but it's also a focus by governments, and we can't minimize that issue. And I guess it goes to the issue of nations always have a moment where they have to decide whether or not they want to be respected, which China already is, but will they also want to be trusted as a member of the world community. And I think right now for China, what we'll see over the next couple of years is the issue of the evolution of whether or not it's going to be trusted. be trusted by definition means that your country, in essence, is agreeing to the world community's view to a certain extent on how one conducts itself, how one conducts business, how one conducts its internal relations with its own people, how one conducts itself with its neighboring nations. And I think China is going to have a difficult time over the next few years as it tries to decide those issues. The issues of free flow of information, the issue that we saw with respect to Google. That obviously impacts the country's brand. It obviously raises significant issues with respect to other investors. It raises significant issues with people who want to come to a country. I remember many years ago people said to me, we worked on the China Beijing Olympics, that the Beijing Olympics would redefine China. My experience today is no event redefines anybody unless the event is basically a negative event. The press moves on, it dramatically moves on, and within weeks or months we sort of forget to a certain extent that which had the transformation aspect. We're seeing that right now with Chile. 2 weeks ago the entire world was focused on the rescue of the miners. It was a defining moment for how that government was being perceived. I would argue 5 weeks from now it will be once again Brazil, and Chile will be sort of lost in the world. So one event won't do it. China will not be defined by any of the events you mentioned either. I think China will evolve. China will have to decide. But that issue of trust and respect seems to me to still be the most defining issue for countries as they try to do business around the world.
I mean, we're still talking about image in a sense, aren't we? And images do take a long time to evolve, to change. You obviously mentioned the Olympics, the Expo. These things are not necessarily going to make a major impact, although I would argue
they will make an impact.
I think the impact
they make an impact.
Olympics wasn't insignificant.
No, in fact, I would argue the impact of the Olympics was one of the great dramatic moments of the last 10 years, because basically what it showed was it was the opening of China.
Yep.
But it doesn't long-term define China. And I think it was a moment.
And I think if you look perhaps at one of the negative moments most recently in that, I would argue perhaps has been the award of the Nobel Peace Prize to Shanghai. That is a defining moment in a sense for China's brand, or at least perhaps a very important moment for it. Do you think the leadership, your understanding of the leadership's awareness of these issues and how the brand's image rather is being affected by this, do you think there is a great awareness of this?
Well, I can't speak for the leadership or even knowledge of what the leadership decides. We have the expression in America, you can't read tea leaves. And here in China, I suspect that's more true than not. But I do believe that the leadership is fully aware of how this conversation is taking place around the world. I don't think there's any doubt that this leadership has an interest in trying to be more cooperative with the world while at the same time asserting some of its nationalist issues. I mean, we're seeing it in non-proliferation. We're seeing it to a certain extent with certain environmental meetings. I mean, the leadership seems to be trying to reach out, trying to participate. We're seeing with respect to even the G20, even while there's friction, there's clearly an attempt by the leadership to participate as a global citizen. But at the same time, I think there are national interests here that are being discussed with respect to how China is going to conduct itself internally. My experience with most nations is they do not appreciate what they perceive to be outside influence. I would argue that outside influence over time, though, does impact it and does have its point, because outside influence eventually really does result in two corporations think this is a good place to do business. Are products, in essence, enhanced or hurt by the image of the nation that is making it? So my sense is, yes, the leadership is aware of it. I suspect the leadership is probably concerned with it, but I think the leadership is probably much more focused on the internal Chinese issues with respect to those type of questions, rather than necessarily how the rest of the world is looking at it.
You mentioned here, obviously, the concerns about its commercial image, its image abroad to foreign investors. And I mentioned at the beginning that there were rumbles in the foreign investment community. And of course, we're still seeing $100 billion a year going to China.
Absolutely.
It's not very heavy numbers in fact. Let's not take it out of perspective.
Right, there needs to be a lot of perspective.
But is there a sense that this image is changing now? And I mean, there are lots of facets, of course, to the commercial image of China, and we'll discuss perhaps the made in China one in a second, but is there a sense in which this openness is changing, and what do you think is behind it, and what do you think could be done about it? Is there an awareness of this, and what will be done about it?
I think China's image right now is actually Frankly, probably not as good in the commercial sector as it has been in the previous years. I think there's a reality because people realize, how much it takes to invest in China, how long it's going to take necessarily to reap the rewards that they probably thought. I think we're going to be easily reaped as they build out their businesses. At the same time, there's not a company we speak to that doesn't fundamentally tell us that China is probably its #1 market for growth in the future. Everybody has a tendency to talk about the BRIC countries or BRICy countries, but the reality is what they're talking about is China and Brazil. And it's really, when they really sit down, they're talking about China. So I think it's not, the bloom is a little bit off the rose. I mean, some of the joint ventures that have blown up obviously impact how a country is seen, how its brand is. But clearly at the same time, I think there's a sense that China is making strides with respect to law. It's making strides with respect to how people are going to do business. It is making strides with respect to its openness in the tier 2, 3, and 4 cities. So my sense is it's mixed. I mean, I think that's what I would say. If I was sitting here 4 years ago, I think what I would be saying is China is the great opening. China is the great solution to where the world's growth is going to come from. I think right now most corporate boardrooms have a tendency to say yes, but not quite as fast as we once thought. And I think that's the general sense of what the image is right now.
Of course, one area that China does want its image to shift and its brand to shift is the Made in China.
Absolutely.
Is the Made in China area. Although this is improving, I think there's still some room to suggest that the low-quality image, the manufacturing low-quality image, low-cost, low-quality image that is stuck by for quite some years now continues to be a problem. We're still seeing products outside of China that make people sick. We're still getting products to some degree that fall apart, although I must say that this is becoming, to some quite a degree, a thing of the past, but nevertheless the image is still there. What is that fair at one level? Are we seeing, is China sort of somehow having to fight against a very, very difficult perception that's difficult to budge on?
I think, Charles, what China is facing right now is an issue that many nations face when they basically build a business based on original equipment manufacturers or OEMs, which is, by definition, the OEMs don't have brand names. And therefore, the OEMs don't stand for anything other than, in a funny way, the cheapest product within the supply chain, and that's why it's built here. But I think that's an evolutionary process. I think China is about to turn some of its OEMs into brands that will then begin to be recognized outside in the rest of the world. I mean, one could argue that until Sony came along, Made in Japan was not necessarily perceived as a positive when it came to products that were being sold outside of Japan. I think Samsung has done the same thing for Korea. I have no doubt that China will also quickly become a nation where its brands are respected as it begins to decide that it wants to be more than just an OEM manufacturer, that it actually wants to have brands that begin to strike the rest of the world. We have to remember that with all of the talk of China's strength, other than the natural resources area and maybe higher in Lenovo, you see very few Chinese companies that are actually non-hot resource operating in other nations around the globe. And so to a certain extent, consumers and politicians don't really have a sense yet of what a Chinese brand is or what a Chinese product is. It's just something that's inside of something else. And as you said several years ago, the issues were that something that was inside something else was a concern. I think less so today. But my belief is that the OEMs will soon, and rapidly so, begin to decide that their way to move themselves up the commercial sort of food chain will be to build brands out of their corporations. And when you think about the size of some of these privately owned enterprises, they're quite phenomenal. And their strength and their ability. When you think about how many patents are now being actually granted in China and recognized around the globe, it is very significant from just a few years ago. There's no doubt in my mind that Chinese brands will change that image over time. And Made in China will be, equivalent to being made in any other first-rate economic nation.
I think to be fair, it's already happening, as you can see. I wonder if there are any questions from the audience. Let me throw it down to the floor and just see if there are any questions down. Well, first of all, down there, but trying to get a microphone across to the president.
I'm always nervous when the questionnaire starts with his name as Your Lordship. It's the American in me.
Yes, so I won't be talking about governance, but I have been for 40 years a member of Parliament. my experience of coming to China, I just wonder in the image that we're not looking at China in a Western model concept. For example, I was told earlier by Vice Premier Zhuangqi when I came here in 1997, he gave me a book on the economy. And he asked me what I thought of it. I said, it's remarkable, you have more growth in a year than we have in 10 years, but that is the early stages of industrialization. But I said I was confused. He kept referring to the socialist market economy. What the hell is a socialist market economy? He said, well, I'll tell you about one of your prime ministers who came to China and we took back a panda bear. And then he asked the second time, could he take another panda bear to mate with? He said, it will now cost you $1 million. He said, but the first one was free. Why is the second one $1 million? He said, because it's now the socialist market economy. And I think that was one change beginning to happen in their economy. We can see it in a number of areas. Another one is access to resources. We look at the Chinese model and we condemn them for actually going abroad and doing by contract and getting access to resources of which they are not sufficient in their own country. Every developed country goes through that process. What happened in Europe? We colonized Africa. We failed America. We colonized Africa. And basically gave them a few bird-feeds and the Bible and told them, you know, you've now got democracy and pitched all their resources. The Chinese are doing it by contract. That seems to be a more peaceful and harmonious way to deal with it. My point is this, if you look at the developments democratically, socially, economically, what we are witnessing in China, I think, is the same industrialized process that each one of us went through, the high growth economies. And they are the ones now that have achieved that, going through that process. So they're challenged by the trade unions for social rights and better wages. They're trying for the demands for greater democratic rights. These are all the processes of changes that take place in economies that go through this change. Are we not judging them in our Western model and saying, this is the model and this is the way you should go? Perhaps with the global world changing as it is, we have to judge them differently. Therefore, the image is more about what we think it should be rather than the change situation of a powerful country going through its process of industrialization.
I guess I would argue that notion, which is that the world has changed in a different way to me, which is the scrutiny of how nations conduct themselves today is such that one could argue perhaps didn't exist, or at least the ability for recourse didn't exist in previous years. And whether one likes it or not, the reality is the world does look at how countries conduct themselves. Now, I don't think that's a negative for China. In fact, I would argue in some respects it's working for China. When China has an issue of strikes, in some respects that symbolizes strife. In other respects, what it symbolizes is freedom. And that's how the world interprets it. I think China's image, which is that it's allowing its workers to seek a higher standard of living. And that, I think, redounds well to the Chinese government, and I think it redounds well to the Chinese economic system. So I don't think it's a question of whether or not one judges by Western or one judges by Asian. I think the reality is the world judges today. And the world gets all of its information simultaneously, and it comes to a collective opinion in many respects about how one participates in the world's affairs. And so the reality is confronted with that issue today, as is the United States, as is Great Britain, and as is every other nation. And so I suspect that images and brands are no longer in the control of the leaders because of that. They're now in the control of all those people who are receiving all their information, whether it's through the internet, the news media, or other broadcasting mediums. And so that's just a reality. So I don't think it's a matter of judging by Asian. I don't think it's a matter of judging by Western. I think it's just a matter of the world collectively is lately coming to decisions. Those decisions hurt. Look what happened with Russia. It was in a great place, and then turned off the gas to Europe. I would argue that Putin's image and Russia's relationships took a tremendous shock based on what in the past was just the exercise of economic power.
Other questions, observations down in front of you. Please get a microphone down in front.
Hello, it's Tim Sun. I'm a colleague of Harris Diamonds, and we've looked at a lot of political branding issues around the world the last few years. I just want to follow up on Lord Prescott's question, because it seems to me one thing we do know is that there are countries that are highly respected in the world but to have a political system which is very, very different to that of the West, I think in particular Singapore, which many people may not think is the greatest bastion of democracy and freedom in the world, but which people nonetheless, we know from the research, admire, respect, are pleased to trade there and so on. And I just wonder when it comes to China, whether you don't feel that, in one sense, the Chinese government is missing an opportunity by getting across the message that China is different. This is a civilization that's been around for thousands of years. It has an enormous population. It's quite rightly concerned with feeding those people. It's quite rightly concerned with social harmony, which is a phrase that it uses a lot. It has a lot of problems in its own terms, which are perhaps not susceptible to a transplanting of a Washington style or a Westminster style or a Brussels style democracy just like that, because as Lord Prescott said, we spent many, many centuries developing those institutions. So is there not perhaps an opportunity for China to, in a sense, help people to understand better what its issues are and how it's trying to develop those? Feeding people is important when you've got over 1 billion of them, and having harmony is important. So I just wanted to explore that issue. I suppose it's the difference again between brand and image. Are there not real truths here which could be communicated to the world if the encouragement of dialogue?
Harris from Martin Weber-Shandwick,
Right.
employee to his boss.
I guess what I would say about that is China's great strength is that in many respects the world is not only looking at it with fascination, but to a certain extent the world is looking at it with an interest level. I mean, people outside of China, when we look at some of the statistics, they want to travel here. They want to take advantage of what they perceive is both ancient and new. They want to understand Asia through the eyes of China. They want to see the world that is different than the Western world. China has incredible strengths right now. There's also issues about the Chinese people. When you look at China as a whole and you look at the data on China, this is a country ripe for tourism. This is a country ripe to take advantage of its cultural history. This is a country that has immense strength. In fact, one could argue it has 1 billion more stories that it can basically tell to the world right now, and the world is hungry for those stories. I think to a certain extent, the nature of such a strong economy and such a strong nation is actually overwhelming those stories right now. In fairness, I think the Chinese have not necessarily done enough to really take advantage of those stories and really sell them to the rest of the world as a means to building upon its image. But China, I'm not in any way suggesting is anything but a country that people are both fascinated in, generally people want to build and invest in, and generally people see as an economic and a world power for the next 50, 100 years that's going to stride among the nations. So yes, I think at the end of the day, the strengths of the China image, which will one day turn into a brand, are immense. And I would have been myself.
We have time for one more question. Yeah. Microphone.
Working? Yeah. Thank you. Nicholas de Borsac from Pacifica. I think we could be forgiven for thinking during the Bush years that he didn't really care a damn about what people thought outside America, but cared more about what people inside America thought about.
And not clearly that much there either.
Sorry?
Not clearly that much inside either.
Okay, but more. But so in China, how would you kind of equate the way that the government wants to be seen domestically and how it wants to be seen externally and how that interaction plays? And if you understand my question.
Yes, I do. I think all governments, first and foremost, always gauge their success by their internal likability factor, if nothing else is said. I think to a certain extent the disappointment the world has with Barack Obama was a misunderstanding of who Barack Obama was first and foremost going to be, which was the President of the United States. I think the same thing is true for Chinese leaders. Chinese leaders, first and foremost, are responsible to their own people. They're responsible to build a greater standard of living. They're responsible to basically make sure that China has all of the assets and attributes that it needs to basically be successful in the future. And so they, like all leaders, are going to spend 95% of their time inwardly focused with respect to what is the reaction to their policies. But that other 5% of the time does require an understanding in today's world that cooperation is a necessity to achieve one's goals long term. The world needs to be a peaceful place in order for countries to prosper. I think everybody is agreeing on that. there's a reason to join into multinational associations, and I think Chinese leaders are doing that. I mean, it's interesting to me that Chinese leaders, when they come to the United States, speak on U.S. college campuses. When they go to Europe, they have conversations with intellectuals and the elites, in addition to the foreign policy folks. I think when they stride around the world, they are trying to make sure that they are understood. But I would never, ever misunderstand where their first and foremost thought process is going to be. It's going to be focused on their own people and how their people react to those issues. You know, in every country, there is a cult of nationalism that exists. But that is only seen from outside the world. Inside the world, people just, inside your country, you just think, this is what my leader is supposed to be. Protect my interests. Make sure my interests are paramount. And I think that's what Chinese leaders are first and foremost going to do for the foreseeable future, and perhaps forever.
There's one last question, really, and it's partly to do with the political transition underway with the changes that we're going to see. Obviously, you were mentioning that China's image abroad is largely dictated in many ways by what people outside China think of it, and perhaps the government can only marginally have an impact on that image and on that brand. What would your advice be to new leaders coming into China about its future brand, its image abroad, insofar as it was able to make an impact on that?
Well, I think like everybody's fascinated by a debate that seems to be taking place with respect to how China will develop, and that debate has gone public in a way that I don't think any of us have seen in prior years. And so I think the debate itself, in a funny way, is influencing how people think about China. Because what people are thinking right now is it's a more open society, at least at the leadership level, than perhaps previously understood. There is a debate taking place. It's taking place in newspapers. It's taking place in speeches. It's taking place after the meetings. And so, first and foremost, that is, I think, from the world's perspective, always going to be an interesting process. We saw that with respect to Great Britain recently, the debate in their election that took place. We're watching it in France with respect to whether the government accedes to the demands of the so-called street. We're watching in the United States today as we see whether or not there's a repudiation of the administration that was elected 2 years ago. That helps define nations. That debate helps define nations. China seems to be having a bit of an open debate. I think that is going to help define this nation in the years to come. The results of that debate will obviously have the biggest impact. And that, like everybody else, I'm curious to see how it turns out.
Thanks very much, Nathan.